Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Janne I'm the president and CEO of the Truman Center for National Policy, and I have a really easy job tonight, and it's just to welcome this really phenomenal panel and all of you. It feels really good to be in person here at the Chicago Council, our wonderful partners. Thanks so much for having us, and to those of you joining us online, sorry you're missing really good snacks, but we hope we'll see you in person next time. Some of you might be new to Truman, and so I just wanted to share a little bit about who we are and what we do as we get underway. And give you a little bit of framing about why this convening is a little bit different and we think special. So Truman's mission is to unite and equip a diverse community of American leaders to produce timely, innovative, and principled solutions to complex national security challenges. And we achieve that mission by focusing on 4 strategic priorities. And you'll see the touch points, we're 4 for 4 tonight. Identify, recruit, and retain best-in-class national security leaders of today and tomorrow, several of whom are here with us today in the audience, and leaders in particular who reflect the diversity of our country. To promote principled American global engagement, to modernize national security institutions, and to fortify domestic foundations of America's global strength. So we're in Chicago because we're doing all of those things through a very special program with our friends here at the Chicago Council. So we're hosting a workshop with a number of really incredible students, many of whom are in the audience with us, to talk about nuclear security and also to seek to diversify that field. Diversity, broadly speaking, is a huge priority for Truman. We believe that better decisions that are more relevant to the needs of today and tomorrow, come when we have all of America's talent at the table. And we know that that has not always been the dynamic in nuclear security in particular. I think Rachel probably has some stories. And so we know that that field, while historically has been disproportionately elite and closed, is in need of a lot of fresh talent. And the issues, as we're reminded from Russia's invasion in Ukraine to North Korea to Iran, we have a lot of important challenges from which to choose, and it's time to pass that baton to the next generation. So part of what we're doing is bringing that talent into this field. So we know also that nuclear policy began in secrecy through weapons programs like the Manhattan Project that remained isolated amongst a handful of scholars throughout the Cold War. But that's no longer necessarily the dynamic and the way that things play out in countries worldwide. So this is one of our efforts to change that. It's the first of several workshops we'll be hosting with university students around the country to really bring these issues to the forefront of our national attention, so that we really raise diverse voices so that we can inform those responses to our challenges and really connect our nuclear challenges to other national and transnational challenges, because what happens in nuclear often doesn't stay in nuclear. It's a dynamic give and take, as we'll talk about this evening. And this panel is top-notch, and we're all in for a treat this evening. We couldn't ask for a better collection of experts. So I want to just extend my thanks again to the Chicago Council team for their partnership. And I also want to thank the MacArthur Foundation for their support of their work and really believing in the value of the next generation of folks who were interested in this important and dynamic field. So with that, let me turn it over to Rachel and sit back, relax, and prepare to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Janne. Can everyone hear me okay? Mic's good. Hello to those of you on YouTube. So glad to have you here in person, and those of you on the live stream today and then and who knows when. So I'm delighted to be here. You have my bio in your papers, and the President CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And I say that just because we are Chicago-based. There is a long Chicago history. There's a reason that MacArthur is here in Chicago and is engaged on nuclear issues. Fermi split the atom here, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was founded here in 1945. I'm delighted to introduce the panel. Just a couple of things too about like hometown connections. I had worked at the Chicago Council for 7 years, so it's really a delight to return. And I was telling Janne that when Truman, I don't know how many years ago now, was beginning to think about possibly expanding to Chicago, so 10, 12 so years ago, I hosted in my house the first 12 people who thought they might be interested. And that's all I did. And after that, they just totally ran with it. And now it's one of the most dynamic in the Truman chapter, I understand. So there's like a long history. So yes, we're so delighted to have you here. Okay, so let me first introduce our panelists tonight. You have their bios, I believe, in front of you, but let me do them some justice. Lily Wojtowicz, no, I got that wrong. I was practicing it too. Wojtowicz, it's literally, yes, is the Janne E. Nolan Fellow of Nuclear Security and a PhD student at American University. Her focus is on deterrence, but she's sophisticated in polling work, which she did when she was here at the Chicago Council, where you worked for a few years, so there's a hometown connection there. It comes from Beloit College, but if you look at her bio, been at the Monterey Institute, Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Pro, Brookhaven National Labs. If there's like an important institution working on nuclear issues, Lily has worked at them, or if she hasn't, she will work at them because they're clearly looking for her. So Lily, thanks for being here. And Kevin, your hometown connection is you're a fourth-year PhD student at Notre Dame, so we count that as being in the Chicago broader area. I don't know how South Bend feels about that, but we feel really good about that. Is broadly interested in race and international relations theory, so perfect person to be speaking with us, as Jenna kind of laid out, and has been an APSA, American Political Science, Diversity Fellow. APSA is like the big political science association in the field, so has been on a diversity fellowship, his works in qualitative and multi-method research, and we were just talking about this, did a summer workshop at the Analysis of Military Operations and Strategy, SWAMOS, which, if you haven't heard of it, is just a fantastic training ground for next generation strategic thinkers. And Mari, who I'm so excited to introduce, because Mari is speaking for us at the Bulletin next week, and as a keynote for us, so it's a twofer for me here. Mari is a partner for Mobilization at Global Zero. Global Zero is one of the most important organizations in the nuclear space, especially around mobilization and grassroots engagement. She works on nuclear disarmament, social justice, and intersectionality, which we're going to talk about tonight. She is on the steering committee of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, and where I think we first overlap was maybe in Organizations in Solidarity, which is an organization that the Bulletin is proud to be a member of. So delighted. And same, just like others, has been at BASIC when she was in the UK, and all of the kind of CSIS and all of the leading institutions. So we're in for a great conversation, and I'll just end his passion for Chicago sports teams. So a Chicagoan born and bred, I believe, and so we'll take that too as part of the hometown connections. So enough with the intros. I just want to lay out for you, I just want to do 2 minutes of framing, and then before we turn to the conversation, to say where we sit today, like this is not your parents' international nuclear landscape. And I want to just run through how different this moment is, and why we need new thinking and new voices. Nuclear politics can often be considered kind of staid, because during the Cold War, there were certain ground rules laid, and then everyone operated within them and knew how to manage the situation. Wasn't easy, was complicated, had different, but there was a certain parameters in which everyone was operating. Not so anymore. This is the Wild West of national security, which should terrify us all because of the consequences of it being the Wild West. This isn't guns and on horseback. right? This is civilization as we know it. And this is the moment to be paying attention to these issues because everything is churning. So what do I mean by that? So even before Ukraine, I was saying this. So let's just lay out where we were before Ukraine, and then we'll take a quick jog forward post-Ukraine, then we're going to talk about it, right? So before Ukraine, arms control was in complete disarray. So we had gone through a period of where we had no arms control from about 1945 till about the 1970s. From about the 1970s to 2010 was a golden age of arms control. There was a lot of problems, but there was a belief that we could actually control and reduce, maybe eliminate, but certainly reduce nuclear weapons. Brings us up to about 2010, just after Obama wins the Nobel Peace Prize for saying he's going to try to actually work and create a world free of nuclear weapons. 2010 is the last arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. After that, a complete deterioration. Nothing makes sense anymore. The US is pulling out of agreements. Russia is violating agreements. And it's this terrible spiral to where we are now, which is that there's basically one arms control agreement left standing between the US and Russia, and even that's kind of questionable about whether it'll be renewed. It's not really renewed, but that will continue. Every major country is investing in their nuclear weapons. Every nuclear state is investing in their nuclear weapons. The United States is on the cusp of spending somewhere between $1.3 and $1.8 trillion over the next 30 years. Pakistan probably has the fastest growing arsenal in the world. China investing very heavily in this. So every nuclear country is reevaluating and investing. Very different than in the past. And there's new actors on the scene. North Korea, Iran, others, I just mentioned Pakistan and India, China's investment. This is not a bilateral nuclear space. It never was, but it was really between the US and Russia. Now there's new actors and they're all learning as well from what's going on from Ukraine. So that's before Ukraine. Fast forward to where we sit today. You have the leader of one of the most powerful nuclear countries in Russia threatening nuclear use. We have never seen that in recent times, violating norms of what's to be expected. We have the Russian leader using nuclear power plants as landmines, basically, of massive and terrorizing proportions. A shoring up of NATO that we couldn't have expected in recent years, and a testing on the battlefield of advanced weapons. So take what we had before, stir in some Ukraine, and this is where we find ourselves. So to sort all this out of how we're going to think about it, we're turning to Lily first. So Lily, my question to you, and what I hope you talk about a little bit to kick us off, is you're really thinking through issues of deterrence. And deterrence can feel a little bit like, oh, deterrence, haven't we been kind of talking about? But it's fundamental to where we are in Ukraine now. Who's being deterred? How do you deter the Russians? But also, how do we think about nuclear weapons in the context of deterrence? Deterrence is all about stopping others from doing something, and nuclear weapons are now seeming very, very relevant. So could you take a little time just to talk about what you're interested in deterrence and why?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, let me start with a personal anecdote. When I was at Monterey in 2012, and I would tell people that my subject matter was Russian foreign policy and nuclear deterrence, the response I got almost always was, oh, why? In 2014, speaking of relevancy, I got just after Russia annexed Crimea, I got a text message from my mother that said, "Hey, you're finally relevant." And I say that not just to highlight my mother's sense of humor, but because a lot of the language of deterrence, the muscle memory of deterrence, almost atrophied, right? After the Cold War ended, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of concern initially about the deterrence landscape with Russia, inheriting the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, but that really dissipated quickly. And so for 30 years, very few people really did think about deterrence. Our allies didn't often think about deterrence. We in the US frequently didn't think about deterrence. And so what does it mean then now when it started, right, in 2022, we're almost at the year anniversary, that there's a war in Europe, that not only a nuclear weapon states, but one of the most powerful, or with the largest arsenal nuclear weapon states, has invaded a neighbor. And very early on, all of a sudden, we had to think through, what can we do about it? There was a lot of conversation in the United States that we need to do something now. And there was immediately pushback saying, no, we're really limited in terms of how we can act. So that's a conversation that I think is starting to unfold. What can we do to counter a threat like Russia when they are a nuclear weapons possessor? It doesn't help that they're essentially an authoritarian state, right? And that if an operation like the one they're undertaking now starts to look really risky for Putin, he's a really real incentive. His life is on the line for this war turning out decently, right? Or for him to be able to message that he got what he wanted. At the same time, we have allies in Europe and we have allies in Asia who, like I said, were not as present in the conversation about deterrence over the last 30 years. And now they're in a position, not just in Europe, but in Asia, thinking, are we safe? And can the United States defend us, right? Ukraine was not a member of NATO before this war started. Now, there was going to be there's already that conversation about whether Ukraine should be a NATO ally. But it was not a NATO ally beforehand, but it still made these countries feel incredibly insecure, right? They put their trust in the United States to protect them from existential threats. And we're left wondering, how can we still do that today after this the Cold War has ended? At the same time, fascinatingly so, there was a ton of momentum just before Russia invaded Ukraine towards disarmament. There was concern. I remember reading in The Economist and Foreign Affairs just before, or maybe it was Foreign Policy, before the invasion, that Germany was sleepwalking towards disarmament, right? There was concern that the new incoming government, that the Scholz government that included Green Party members, didn't have the backbone, didn't have the interest in investing in things like dual capable aircraft systems. And so, a big question that I have is, once the dust settles, where do we stand when it comes to disarmament, right? Is there still that interest there? If we get, and we all hope that we don't, but if we get to a point where even low-yield nuclear weapons are used, tactical nuclear weapons are used, or we have a sort of Cuban Missile Crises style situation, is that going to push the needle in favor of disarmament? Or is it going to push the needle in favor of proliferation? And I think we could go either way right now.
So I forget whether we plan to go to Mari or Kevin next. What did we decide? Because I can go either way.
I think it's moderator's choice.
Oh, okay. All right. Actually, so Kevin, I'm going to come to you next because you think a lot about North-South relations. And a lot of this original conversation between the US and Russia and then US and European allies is very north to north. And what we're also very aware of is that while much of the news is about the support that the United States and NATO allies have. Around the world, it doesn't look that way. It looks very different. So maybe you could take us a little broader now, and some of the things that that Lily's been talking about, deterrence, and can you talk a little bit about kind of north-south and what you're seeing, and maybe start introducing the TPNW?
Okay. So when it comes to north-south relations, it's interesting, right? So on the one hand, when the country signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was a general understanding that there would be steps made towards disarmament. And so for the Global South countries to accept that type of deal, it's made with the intention that whatever institutionalized inequality that came out of it was going to be temporary, right? That this was going to be something that was a deal that had to be made and that eventually it would go away. Now, as we've seen over the last 60 years, that hasn't really been the case, right? To the extent that the United States or Russia have reduced their stockpiles, it's usually because, as Lily had pointed out earlier, the United States has just made technological improvements. They don't need as many nuclear weapons because they're just being more effective with what they have, right? And so what we see is a push from the Global South countries to say, listen, you guys made a promise and you're not following through. So now we're gonna push you on it. And then you have things like nuclear weapon free zones, the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons Treaty that was signed in January 2021, where it pretty much does say, listen, we're going to use the order that you built with the promises that you've made, and we're just going to put you to stand by your words, right? If we're going to say that disarmament's the goal, then let it be the goal. So when we have things like the TPNW, it really is an effort. And if you see the signatories on it, a lot of it is countries in the Global South. Like no nuclear weapons state has signed on to it. It is an advancement. It is a push to say, we're taking this seriously, and you should too.
So Mario, that's a perfect transition to you. You work on mobilization, grassroots effort, and intersectionality. And what's so interesting about the TPNW, this is a global movement to make nuclear weapons illegal. All the nuclear weapon states haven't signed it. And also, there's a belief that it may challenge some of the existing architecture and it takes them through a different route. But there's a lot of mobilization around the TPNW, and it's something that is exciting a lot of new advocates to rethink. And so what I'd love for you to talk about is, what are you doing at Global Zero in terms of mobilization and movement building, and how does intersectionality, why is that important to your work?
Yeah, in all honesty, I think intersectionality at its core gets overblown. People try and overcomplicate the concept. Really what it is looking at two seemingly disparate issues and then saying, where do they connect? And then what impact do they have on one another? And then when you start to think about the impacts they have on one another, then you can start to create holistic solutions to large-scale problems. I think the reason that we've seen such interest in mobilizing around the nuclear weapons issue at this moment is because, at least at Global Zero, what we've tried to do is link it to other issues. So climate, for example. If we think about the chance, right now we know that the chance of a nuclear weapon being used is low, yet still unacceptably high. And if a nuclear weapon is used, we know after that the Earth becomes uninhabitable to civilians. But in the meantime, as the climate crisis is continuing to rage, and we talked about things like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we are already seeing a food and water crisis, which could lead to continued issues. And if we look at these two different things as two completely separate issues, we're missing the middle point. We're missing positive solutions and policy entry points that we can use that can equitably impact people across communities. So when we're doing our work and we're thinking about mobilizing, we're going into communities and having conversations about how does this impact you in your daily life. I'll give you a local example. Think about Chicago. How often do you hear people say, we need to invest in our public school system? We need to find the funds to do so. Well, Rarely do we ask questions about our continually ballooning nuclear weapons budget or our even larger military budget. You just said they're on track to spend over $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years. Can you imagine what you could do in communities for safety and care if you reinvested that into spaces? That is creating national security solutions. But you can also think about that in a global context. The people that are continually impacted and honestly disproportionately impacted that we talk about at Global Zero so often are the most disenfranchised populations. You see that across the globe. It's currently happening in both the maintenance and development of these weapons. It's happening in nuclear testing, uranium mining, the reallocation of funds for, basic human needs. And I'm talking about people of color, I'm talking about socioeconomically disenfranchised, you name it. And if we don't start bringing these policy understandings, these human pieces to these weapons, then we're not going to be effective in creating equitable policy. When we get to this world past nuclear weapons, then you won't have a security and equitable structure that looks good for everyone. So I think it's incredibly important that we continue to have these conversations about the weapons, yes, but it's the people that are being impacted, and that's the opportunity to positively impact humanity.
Rachel, if I can just say one thing on Mary's point. The important thing is that everything you just said, it has a long history to it. Right? You can go back to speeches by Martin Luther King. You can go back to Langston Hughes. You can go back to activists like Dick Gregory, and all of them through the civil rights movement, they've actively been against nuclear weapons for the exact same reasons that she's pointed out. And so it is something that there is a history to it, and it's sort of it's taking activists like you, like Global Zero, that's really bringing it out and bringing it to the forefront in ways that maybe weren't as happening as before.
Absolutely. We definitely stand on their shoulders. I encourage people to continue to read the literature of the civil rights movement, because when you look at that, you look at the ways in which they engaged with the global south, the ways in which they went to places like Ghana right before we saw the nuclear test in Western Sahara, and they encouraged them to advocate for the abolition of weapons, and the ways in which testing would affect them over time. There's a long-standing history about conversations about security being more open and more equitable. We're just seeing the resurgence in this moment as we've seen a national and honestly global shift to a more inclusive conversation about how we see safety and security.
And then, Lily, what are you seeing among your peers at the university when you're in classrooms? What are you seeing in terms of who's showing up and the questions that they're asking?
I mean, I'm an oddity in that I study security, right, in a PhD program. And it's really been that way for a while. I know that, I imagine when you were in graduate school, right, there are a lot of people studying security. It's more and more rare. I will say that I've done survey work on these issues. I've done focus groups on these issues. And probably the most disheartening takeaway that I've gotten from a lot of that is that people feel hopeless, right? Why engage on these issues if only a handful of people can affect them? Now, I disagree. I push back. You can look to the civil rights movement. You can look to the Euro missile crisis, both in the U.S. and internationally, in these major protest movements. And, I think that a big part of the problem is there is this such a strongly held belief, right, that only a few people can impact change. Well, what that does is, it generates almost apathy, right? When I was getting my master's in 2012, one of the faculty members at Monterey used to joke that he wished that a channel played Dr. Strangelove 24/7, right? Our generation didn't grow up doing duck and cover drills. We didn't experience the visceral witnessing of these crises occur, right? I mean, this war with Ukraine and the occasional rhetoric about nuclear use is the closest we've come to those experiences that previous generations had during the Cold War. On top of that, we're facing a horrifying climate crisis, right? We're facing a reckoning about race and gender in this country, and so there's so many other incredibly important issues that people engage in. What incentive do they have to engage in a topic that they have no control over?
So Kevin, let me come to you. I was going to ask, just because you're also studying security, if you're an auditee at Notre Dame, or if Notre Dame has a different kind of environment, but I'd like you to kind of answer that, but also pick up where, like Lily just served this over to you, this kind of reckoning of race and gender in the context of what you're studying of national security is like right in your sweet spot. So maybe you can continue to talk about how you're navigating that at Notre Dame.
So, like Lily, I guess I'm also an oddity a bit at Notre Dame, but for a bit different reasons. So Notre Dame, they pride themselves on being security guys. We have, the Chicago Council advisors like Mike Dash there, and Eugene Goals played a really prominent role during the Obama administration under the Department of Defense. So there is a lot of security studies work that's being done. It's very policy focused. Now the problem is that it's still very much, they're fighting the last war, so to speak, right? They're still debating the same issues from the 90s. They're still debating the same Cold War issues. So there is sort of this staleness to it where there's not much new going on. Now, that being said, I've had the fortune of being able to come in and say, listen, I'm interested in issues of race and national security. And I've been able to find support for that. Now, I'm the only person doing anything race related. There's nobody doing anything gender related. And so, it is a bit of a weird spot in that sense, where, whatever I say is pretty much like, I'm in a room by myself having these conversations, right? Everybody else is happy to listen, and that's important too, and they encourage me, but it is one of those things where we do need more of that, so that way, there can be some dialogue, right? I don't know where I'm wrong unless somebody tells me.
Mm-hmm. So picking up on that, Mari, what's so interesting right now at Global Zero is they're bringing together two organizations, Global Zero, which used to be on college campuses, but began focusing more on and internationally, but focusing more on Washington politics, but they've just incorporated Beyond the Bomb, which is a grassroots organization. So you've been talking a little bit about how you've been thinking about this and how but how are you beginning to build these strategies so that Kevin's not alone in working on it, and also so that there's a real conversation? How important is it? Where is it important? When is it important? How to kind of bring these issues together in a way that then affects change? Can you help us continue to kind of think about that?
And I think we're doing that right now, right? We're having the conversation outside of the DC Beltway and outside of the academia. That is the start of making this an issue that is no longer siloed into spaces that feel untouchable for your average just international citizen. And that's one of the first things that we're doing, right? And I think what makes it easy for Global Zero to set forward is we have an action plan. We're not ashamed to say we have a plan for how do you get all of the nuclear weapon states to the table, start to have these conversations. We think about the remediation for victims of nuclear testing. We are thinking about what are the intersectional issues, these things, and we're wrapping them together. I think one thing that's incredibly important to think about, particularly for this generation, is they don't operate on siloed issues. We already heard you say they think about race, they think about gender, they think about class, they think about voting. You run the list. They expect that every time they are going to work on a social issue or existential crisis, they should all be overlapping. You should be able to find and pull the strings where the systems are interlocked, and that should be able to create a space where you can create change. I think one of the most important and catalytic things we're doing in our work is we're making that central. We're saying, if your issue is voting rights, let's say your issue is like voting rights in Georgia, well, let's have a conversation about the disenfranchised communities that have been generationally impacted by the nuclear sites in Georgia, who have been asking for things in both local and state government. How do we work with you on your voting rights issue for you to then work with us on our nuclear issue? And we do that across the globe. We find the spaces where we can engage with impacted communities, local communities, activists, and policy experts to find tangible, large-scale solutions. There's no place, at least to us, where you can have strong foreign policy and national security unless there is the diversity sitting at the table where we are both respecting the lived experiences of the impacted and the policy expertise of both academics and policy experts. That is where we meet in the work that we do every day, and we're hoping by making that our example, we can then bring other people into the fold, give them the opportunity to activate, and then take that and bring it out into the regular world with other people.
It's very inspiring. I'm mindful of time, and we're going to go to the audience, so please get ready with your questions. We're going to take questions from the microphone that's standing at the middle of the aisle there. But let me ask a last question to all three of you. The issue is raised, like there's so many issues to care about. So I have a 16-year-old daughter, right? They're sheltering in place. They're at school, right? They're worried about school. There are so many issues that they are grappling with, and climate change is very prevalent. You know, the marches after George Floyd, they're very kind of racially aware. There's so much. How and why should they cut in on this particular issue, which seems so difficult to change? And it's a question I know we all ask ourselves. I have my answer at the bulletin, but I'd love to hear your answers for where can people make change? How do they affect this big issue that we talk about of nuclear security and these big numbers in the budgets and these big decisions that state actors are making all the time? So it's a hard question, but even if you want to find like a place that people, because it's probably a question on people's mind, both on YouTube and in the room. So I'm going to go backwards to give Lily the opportunity to not be the first one through on the questions. So Mari, this is very much in your sweet spot. You've been answering this all evening, but how do you think about that? How do you answer that question?
I think first and foremost, I don't beg somebody to leave their issue. The proximate threats that people are experiencing on a daily basis are incredibly real, and they have every right to continue to work on that issue. My goal is always, as you work on that issue, let me bring you into this other issue that is constantly impacting you. And if I can talk to you and educate you, and you can see the importance of why getting to a place of abolition is essential for us to have a more safe and secure world, then I'm doing my job every day. So that means hopefully providing educational opportunities both to regular citizens, to students. That is also writing op-eds and pieces in places like the Bulletin where we continue to amplify and uplift this issue, and then providing spaces for people to have tangible outlets. I feel like the primary issue with bringing young people in particular into this issue is they think, oh, why now? Or, oh, it's old, or, oh, it doesn't look like me. I think honestly, by simply existing in a framework where I am calling for positive nuclear policy changes and disarmament and showing that somebody that looks like me can do it is going to do something for somebody else. I will say Undersecretary Jenkins did it for me, and I am hoping that by simply existing and continuing to push for these issues, somebody else is gonna wanna continue to step into these shoes.
So many people have said that of Undersecretary Jenkins. She's just, the people she's brought in, it's just constant and regular. She's amazing. Kevin, how do you answer that question as you think about it? Because also, we all need to justify it for ourselves every day, right? Like when we wake up, we're like, So how do you think about it?
And so the way I think about it is, I like to think that my research, my work, my teaching, that it matters. And look, I know that the world is bigger than me and structural issues are extremely hard to change. But whatever I can do to get the world that I want to live in, that's what I want to do, right? So whether, it's writing on these issues, is sort of trying to think about, listen, when we talk about nuclear policy, like what's the sort of biases that are clouding our thinking, right? When I talk to students and I just bring them, awareness to saying, listen, here's how maybe the discourse around North Korea isn't necessarily the most fruitful, right? Maybe we should, think about, trying to see it from how their logic, their reasoning, right? So that way it's not just, the United States, like this very sort of American viewpoint where it's just sort of like they're not doing what we want them to do, and so they're wrong or they're irrational or so on and so forth, right? So when I think about it, I know that more than likely whatever I write or whoever I teach is not going to go on to change the world, or at least not become the next president or anything like that. But if I can get a few students or get a few people at, say, the State Department that read my work, or it pops up in a policy briefer somewhere, or if one day I'm in front of Congress advising or anything like that, I'm just trying to do the best I can with what I have.
That's a great answer. Lily, how about you? How do you think when people are like, well, what difference can I make?
Yeah, I think when you get to that question of why I'm engaged in this topic, why I'm interested in this, my immediate mind went to the fact that You can read entire books on nuclear deterrence with no mention of humans, with no mention of people. You can read entire books on nuclear deterrence that never outwardly say, if you do X, we will strike you with nuclear missiles and this will be the impact, right? We have so removed humanity often from the topic, not just of deterrence, but often proliferation. And yet, what I have learned in Vienna, in Berlin, in DC, is there are individuals working on all of these issues. There are individuals with deep personal connections with the other individuals working on these issues, right? When you sit and watch ambassadors from the global south take ambassadors from the P5 to task for not living up to their disarmament commitments, those are people, those are individuals. And that's what drives me. That's what I find fascinating about this, is that we've tried so hard to remove them, and yet they're so pivotal to the way this whole process works.
That's great. I want to turn now to questions, and we have one. Please introduce yourself so we know who's asking and where you're coming from.
Yeah, hi, my name is Emily. I'm a research assistant at the council. Thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with us today. My question is about, Mari, I think it was you who said that the risk of nuclear weapons use is low, but still too high. And I was curious if for any of you, in terms of your research priorities or your institutional plans, you see the goals for your work as changing if there is some type of nuclear weapon use in the conflict in Ukraine, or are we still fortunate enough to be at a point where those types of contingencies haven't had to be developed yet?
Yeah, I'll say for us, because you were just referencing my comment, and that's exactly what I said. And when I say it is low but unacceptably high, in our view, the existence of nuclear weapons is an unacceptable act, simply put. And so we're thinking on a large scale framework about how do we get to the abolition of these weapons, because that is the only place where everybody is truly going to feel safe. And so it doesn't matter whether it's this crisis previously, as long as we're still in a world where there are nuclear weapons and the nuclear threat still exists, we're unsafe. So we're going to work towards that goal and have steps and an action plan to get there.
Any other thoughts on that?
So I've thought about this issue, right? And I've thought about how many of our theories of nuclear weapons really rely on no future use of nuclear weapons in war, right? So, when I thought about it, I was like, if it happens, right, then all of a sudden, ideas of nuclear peace are out the window. Ideas of deterrence, depending on, who's using the nuclear weapons and against who. All of a sudden, they really suffer a huge blow. Issues of nuclear taboo and the general hesitancy to use nuclear weapons, they take a huge blow. And so all of a sudden, it's like, where are we in that world, right?
Yeah, I'll add to that. Like I mentioned earlier, right, a year ago, or probably more like a year and a half ago, it was absurd. I mean, people were saying that they thought Russia was going to invade Ukraine, but it was absurd. I remember reading a lot of US officials warning about this impending invasion and thinking, but why? What could the possible benefit be versus all of the costs Russia will surely face, right? And yet it happened. And we're all of us who engage on these issues, even though the probability is low, right? I could probably count on two hands the number of moments during this war where I've thought, I don't like this. This is too close, right? This is too conceivable.
I think one thing that I've been thinking about, and this was a few months ago when Vladimir Putin was really threatening the use, and it felt very proximate, like he really might use a low-yield nuclear weapon, and like, what would that mean? So it should be terrifying, because in all the war games that have been run, there's always eventually a nuclear response, and there's a quick move up an escalation ladder that ends up in no longer low-yield exchanges. So when we've actually tested this to the best of our ability in a war game, it ends very, very devastatingly. But I began to think about is there a way in which, if they did use one, that the U.S. and NATO allies or with Ukraine, like, could respond in a non-nuclear manner. And there are plenty of ways that we could, and President Biden was kind of foreshadowing that he wasn't going to get pulled into this. And would there be a way that there would be a very punishing response that didn't require a nuclear response that worked? And what could we learn from that? So could we, as the nuclear community, could we think about how we could get in front of that to show that a nuclear weapon wasn't useful on the battlefield and that we wouldn't respond in kind? And could there be a power for non-proliferation or disarmament made out of what seemed to be such a catastrophic event? And you have to kind of play it back and forth, but as part of the kind of this community, that's what I was really thinking about. Like, could we actually turn this into a moment where all of the money being spent on nuclear weapons were actually proven to be useless because there was still a punishing response? But that would also mean that we would need the population to support a punishing non-nuclear response, which is not usually where anti-war activists and humanists find themselves, right? To say there may be huge benefits to that. So it gets very complicated very fast. But to answer, like, how do you think about how it might change what your like strategic plan says? Like, that's something that we began thinking about. Like, if he actually uses it, is there a moment where we could actually move towards real arms control and disarmament? Craig Kafur, I'm going to introduce you for yourself, but you can say why. Where do you work, and why do I know you?
I work at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Used to work for Rachel Bronson in our studies department, where
That's
I now
how
work.
smart the studies department is.
And I used to work with Lily as well, so it's a great panel here tonight. And we spent a lot of time talking about Europe and Russia and the war in Ukraine. But of course, as you said at the beginning, there's also a lot of nuclear action in East Asia with the North Korean nuclear program, with China's big buildup of nuclear weapons. And of course, now South Korea is getting very anxious about its security and is talking, well, maybe we need to acquire nuclear weapons. This doesn't seem like a great solution to the problem to proliferate nuclear weapons more. So how can the United States work with South Korea to both prevent additional proliferation without exacerbating the problem we already have of having so many nuclear weapons pointed at our adversaries?
Extended nuclear deterrence and what that means for our allies. I think I know the perfect person for that, Lily. Can you take that?
We have done so much damage. We did so much damage to that relationship for some reason between the years of 2016 and 2020. And I watched firsthand, talked to Korean officials who said the day after North Korea tested a missile and got zero response from the US government, who said, how long can we live like this? Under the sword of Damocles. You were supposed to defend us. You were supposed to fix this problem for us. And they made commitments to us, right? When we talk about alliances, when we talk about extended nuclear deterrence, it's not just that we're pledging to come to these allies' aid. They're pledging not to proliferate themselves. They're pledging not to align themselves with our adversaries, right? Not to pursue other alternatives to securing themselves. And so when we don't live up to those commitments over an extended period of time, right? I mean, trust, Kevin, you and I heard this together, right, over the summer. Trust is like an ATM. You can take out and you can take out and you can take out, but if you're not putting anything in, eventually that bank goes empty, right? And you can't take out anymore.
So I've just looked at time and we're already over. So I'm going to this will be the last question. I'm so sorry. For those of you on streaming, there's a long line. I'm very sorry. But last question, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Brenton, and I work actually in the Canadian consulate. building over. I had a question about the effect of the kind of ballistic missile defense systems that are kind of advancing really quickly in certain ways. Like, granted, the testing they did for it was under these really ideal situations that would probably never happen, but there is this kind of growth, and I wanted to know kind of the effects of how that affects future kind of arms deals, right? Because I know that China and Russia doesn't really make it a secret that they want to include our BMD kind of stuff in the deals, right? They want to know, we don't want you to continue advancing, because if you advance to a certain point, the arms deals don't make as much sense as they would. So I was just curious about that, a lot of it, kind of in the different opinions you guys have on that, because didn't know much about it, so.
Great, thank you. Does anyone in particular want to take that?
Again, and not to be the person just constantly talking about allies, right? Although someone from the Canadian consulate might appreciate that. How do you tell Poland that we're not going to invest in ballistic missile defense right now, right? How do you tell our allies in Asia that we're not going to invest in that right now? I do think that there is a utility to being willing to negotiate on arms control in that area. I thought it was, again, a huge mistake when we exited from the ABM treaty. So I'm not advocating that we take those off the table in terms of future arms control agreements, but it's going to have to be incredibly closely negotiated with our allies, because historically we make these agreements with our adversaries, and oftentimes we don't consult our allies, and they have a really clear case in point for why we need to take their concerns seriously right now.
Any last thoughts from Kevin and Mari from you before we close out this session? Just in general, in terms of the questions you've heard, or?
I think it's just incredibly critical. Like, if you're thinking about these issues now, some of you were before the Ukraine crisis, but if this is your first entry point into this issue, I would highly encourage you to do the deep research. If you are motivated to want to get involved, take the time to find the advocacy organizations, the papers, the places where they are doing this good quality research, and engage with them, because they are the people that are going into these rooms both on the ground and in government spaces and trying to advocate for the safer world we are trying to create. So the more informed and empowered everyday citizens feel, the more those voices get reflected when we're voting and when we're able to step into these different political realms. So we are hoping that by listening to this conversation, you are then moved into real advocacy and action.
I agree with everything Mari said, but also just for those more scholarly inclined, this is, again, nuclear research has always been a promising topic of research for pretty much since the dawn of the nuclear age, and it still remains to be so. And the only thing that's changed is, how are we thinking about issues of race? How are we thinking about issues of gender? How are we thinking about, how countries in the global south think about these issues? And so there is a lot more room to run here, and I'm very hopeful on where this is going to go.
And I would just say a last comment, and back to answering your question, even the fact that we're talking about investments in ballistic missile defense, this is what an arms race looks like, right? I mean, say what you want about mutually assured destruction. It was really thought through as a way to try to make it very, very clear that no one had an incentive to strike first, because your adversary had a second strike capability. And it was an effort to try to reduce the amount of spending and what was required to deter. The fact that we're talking about these advancements, if you're building up a missile defense shield, it's because somebody else is investing in those missiles. And they see you investing in your missile defense, and so they're investing higher in their ability, is exactly what's happening to penetrate those defenses. And so what we're seeing in this increased interest and with facts on the ground is what a arms race looks like. You must respond to your adversary, because if you don't, you're vulnerable, and in your response, you're motivating your adversary to also invest. And so as we think about it, kind of brings us full circle, this conversation, what we need to be thinking about now is how do we avoid what we're all watching, which is an arms race 2.0 with multiple actors. Because what we know about arms races is they're very expensive and they're really pointless because your investments drive other investments. And those investments should be being made in other places. And so the question really highlights where we're at and really calls for us all to be paying attention, because we don't want to be wasting this moment and find ourselves back where we were, which is where kind of this back to the future of huge investments being made in trying to keep up with others, right? Just because they're doing that. It's not smart policy, but it's where we're headed. So I think that question wraps up. So ladies and gentlemen, we're over time. I want to thank you for coming out, and please join me in thanking Chicago Council, Truman, and our wonderful panelists.